Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could be here today. We're going to continue reading our selection for right now, which is A War of the Worlds. Um, just to kind of give you a brief recap on some of the stuff that's going on, we have our unnamed narrator who has seen the Martian cylinder land in a sand pit near his house, and the nearby town, has kind of gotten all around. They've been watching this. They've been seeing what's going on. They've been seeing the end of the cylinder unscrew. They've been watching the Martians actually fall out, kind of the cylinder under the uh, much heavier gravity of Earth. They are sort of bulbous creatures with tentacles, and a lot of times they are often compared to an octopus. So our characters are surrounding the pit. They're watching everything that's going on, and then suddenly the Martians have a weapon that comes out that is a heat ray that is basically sweeping across the land and destroying property, just burning the trees immediately catch fire. They've said in there that the glass melts and bricks break, and anything that is wood catches fire, and anything that is water turns to steam instantly. And then, of course, the people. And when the people are hit with this, they're sweeping across, and they're falling as burned bodies. Our uh, uh, our character is watching all this, and of course this is the late 1800s, and so news has not yet gotten around as quickly as it would in our time. So um, some people have contacted the newspapers. Of course, the newspapers have usually a morning and an evening edition, and then they're waiting to kind of hear what's going on, and that's kind of where we left it. So if you are set, we will continue, and we're going to read chapters 9 through 11 of War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. If you have your own copy, we encourage you to read along. If not, of course, you can go to um, uh, our book club page for the San Diego Public Library website, and you can uh, click the link to Project Gutenberg, and the entire thing is there as an ebook, which you can read on your computer, your device, or you can download it as something to be read on a Kindle or whatever you happen to have. So if you're set, we will begin Chapter 9. The Fighting Begins. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, hot and close, with, I am told, a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little through though my wife had succeeded in sleeping, and I rose early. I went into my garden before breakfast and stood listening, but toward the common where there was nothing stirring but a lark. The milkman came as usual. I heard the rattle of his chariot, and I went around to the side gate to ask the latest news. He told me that during the night the Martians had been surrounded by troops, and that guns were expected. Then, a familiar, reassuring note, I heard a train running toward Woking. They aren't to be killed, said the milkman, if if that can possibly be avoided. I saw my neighbor gardening, and chatted with him for a time, and then strolled in to breakfast. It was a most unexceptional morning. My neighbor was of the opinion the troops would be able to capture or destroy the Martians during the day. It's a pity they make themselves so unapproachable, he said. It would be curious to know how they live on another planet, we might learn a thing or two. He came up to the fence and extended a handful of strawberries, for his gardening was as generous as it was enthusiastic. At the same time, he told me about the burning of the pine woods near Byfleet Golf Links. They say, said he, that there's another of those blessed things fallen there, number two. But one's enough, surely. This'll cost the insurance people a pretty penny before everything is settled. He laughed with an air of the greater good humor as he said this. The woods, he said, were still burning, and pointed out a haze of smoke to me. They will be hot underfoot for days on account of the thick soil of pine needles and turf, he said. Then he grew serious over poor Ogilvy. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk down toward the common. Under the railway bridge, I found a group of soldiers, sappers, I think, men in small round caps, dirty red jackets unbuttoned and showing their blue shirts, dark trousers, and boots coming to the calf. They told me that no one was allowed over the canal, and looking along the road toward the bridge, I saw one of the Cardigan men standing sentinel there. I walked with these soldiers for a time and told them of my sight of the Martians and on the previous evening. None of them had seen the Martians. They had but the vaguest idea of them, and so they plied me with questions. They said they did not know who had authorized the movements of the troops. Their idea was that a dispute had arisen at the Horse Guards. The ordinary sapper is a great deal better educated than the common soldier, and they discussed the peculiar conditions of the possible fight with some acuteness. I described the heat ray to them, and they began to argue among themselves. Crawl up under cover and rush 'em, I say I, said one. Get out, said another. What's cover against these 'ere heat? Sticks to cook ya. What we got to do is go as near as the ground'll let us and then drive a trench. Blow your trenches. You always want trenches. You ought to have been born a rabbit, Snippy. Ain't they got any necks, then? Said a third, abruptly, a little contemplative dark man smoking a pipe. I repeated my description. Octopuses, said he. That's what I call 'em. Talk about fishers of men. Fighters of fish it is this time. It ain't no murder killin' beasts like that, said the first speaker. Why not shell the darn things straight off and finish 'em, said the little dark man. You can't tell what they might do. Where's your shells, said the first speaker. There ain't no time. Do it in a rush, that's my tip, and do it at once. And so they discussed it. After a while I left them and went on to the railway station to get as many morning papers as I could. But I will not weary the reader with a description of that long morning and of the longer afternoon. I did not succeed in getting a glimpse of the common, or even Horsell and Chobham church towers were in the hands of the military authorities. The soldiers I addressed didn't know anything. The officers were mysterious as well as busy. I found people in the town quite secure against in the presence of the military, and I heard for the first time from Marshall the tobacconist that his son was among the dead on the common. The soldiers had made the people on the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. I got back to lunch about 2, very tired, for, as I have said, the day was extremely hot and dull. In order to refresh myself, I took a cold bath in the afternoon. About 4:30, I went up to the railway station to get an evening paper, for the morning papers had contained only a very inaccurate description of the killing of Stent, Henderson, and Ogilvy, and the others. But there was little I didn't know. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. They seemed to be busy in their pit, and there was a sound of hammering, and an almost continuous streamer of smoke. Apparently, they were getting ready for a struggle. Fresh attempts have been made to signal, but without success, was the stereotyped formula of the papers. A sapper told me that uh, it was done by a man in a ditch with a flag on a long pole. The Martians took as much notice of such advances as we should take of the lowing of a cow. I must confess that the sight of all this armament, all this preparation, greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent and defeated the invaders in a dozen striking ways. Something of my schoolboy dreams of battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me at the time. They seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3 o'clock there began the thud of a gun at measured intervals from Chertsey or Addlestone. I learned that the smoldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was being shelled in the hope of destroying that object before it opened. It was only about 5, however, that the field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of the Martians. About 6 in the evening, as I sat at tea with my wife in the summer house, talking vigorously about the battle that was lowering upon us, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing, close on the heels of that came a violent, rattling crash quite close to us that shook the ground, and starting out upon the lawn, I saw the tops of the trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church beside it slid down into ruin. The pinnacle of the mosque had vanished, and the roof line of the college itself looked as if a 100-ton gun had been at work upon it. One of our chimneys cracked, as if a shot had hit it, and a piece of it came clattering down the tiles and made a heap of broken red fragments upon the flower bed by my study window. My wife and I stood amazed. Then I realized that the crest of Maybury Hill must be within range of the Martian's heat ray now that the college was cleared out of the way. At that I gripped my wife's arm, and without ceremony ran out into the road. Then I fetched out the servant, telling her I would go upstairs myself for the box she was clamoring for. "We can't possibly stay here," I said, as I spoke the firing reopened for a moment upon the common. "But where are we to go?" said my wife in terror. I thought, perplexed, and then I remembered her cousins at Leatherhead. "Leatherhead!" I shouted above the sudden noise. She looked away from me downhill. The people were coming out of their houses, astonished. "How are we to get to Leatherhead?" she said. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. 3 galloped through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted and began running from house to house. The sun, shining through the smoke that drove up from the tops of the trees, seemed blood red, and threw an unfamiliar, lurid light upon everything. "Stop here," said I. "You are safe here." And I started off at once for the Spotted Dog, for I knew the landlord had a horse and dog-cart. I ran, for I perceived that in a moment everyone on this side of the hill would be moving. I found him at the bar, quite unaware of what is going on behind his house. A man stood with his back to me, talking to him. "I must have £1," said the landlord, "and I've no one to drive it." "I'll give you 2," I said over the stranger's shoulder. "What for?" "And I'll bring it back by midnight," I said. "Lord," said the landlord, "what's the hurry? I'm selling my bit of pig, £2, and you bring it back? What's going on now?" I explained hastily that I had to leave my home, and so secured the dog cart. At the time, it did not seem to me nearly so urgent that the landlord should leave his. I took care to have the cart there and then, drove it off down the road, and leaving it in charge of my wife and servant, rushed into my house and packed a few valuables, such plate as we had, and so forth. The beech trees below the house were burning while I did this, and the palings up the road glowed red. While I was occupied in this way, one of the dismounted hussars came riding up. He was going from house to house, warning people to leave. He was going on, as I came out of my front door, lugging my treasures done up in a tablecloth. I shouted after him, "What news?" He turned, stared, bawled something about crawling out in a thing like a dish cover, and ran on to the gate of the house at the crest. A sudden whirl of black smoke driving across the road hid him for a moment. I ran to my neighbor's door and rapped to satisfy myself of what I already knew, that his wife had gone to London with him and had locked up their house. I went in again, according to my promise, to get my servant's box, lugged it out, clapped it beside her on the tail of the dog cart, and then caught the reins and jumped up into the driver's seat beside my wife. In another moment we were clear of the smoke and noise, and spanking down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill toward Old Woking. In front was a quiet, sunny landscape, a wheat field ahead on either side of the road, and the Maybury Inn with its swinging sign. I saw the doctor's cart ahead of me. At the bottom of the hill, I turned my head to look at the hillside I was leaving. Thick streamers of black smoke, shot with threads of red fire, were driving up into the still air, and throwing dark shadows upon the green tree tops eastward. The smoke already extended far away to the east and west, to the Byfleet pine woods eastward, and to Woking in the west. The road was dotted with people running toward us, and very faint now, but very distinct through the hot, quiet air. One heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, and an intermittent cracking of rifles. Apparently the Martians were setting fire to everything within range of their heat ray. I am not an expert driver, and I had immediately to turn my attention to the horse. When I looked back, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I slashed the horse with the whip and gave him a loose rein until Woking and Send lay between us, and that quivering tumult. I overtook the doctor between Woking and Send. Chapter 10. In the Storm. Leatherhead is about 12 miles from Maybury Hill. The scent of hay was in the air through the lush meadows beyond Riford, and the hedges on either side were sweet and gay with multitudes of dog roses. The heavy firing that had broken out while we were driving down Maybury Hill ceased as abruptly as it began, leaving the evening very peaceful and still. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest while I took supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. My wife was curiously silent throughout the drive, and seemed oppressed with forebodings of evil. I talked to her reassuringly, pointing out that the Martians were tied to the pit by sheer heaviness, and and at the utmost could but crawl a little out of it, but she answered only in monosyllables. Had it not been for my promise to the innkeeper, she would, I think, have urged me to stay in Leatherhead that night. Would that I had. Her face, I remember, was very white as we parted. For my own part, I had been feverishly excited all day. Something very like the war fever that occasionally runs through a civilized community had gotten into my blood, and in my heart I was not so very sorry that I had to return to Mayberry that night. I was even afraid that the last fusillade I had heard might mean the extermination of our invaders from Mars. I can best express my state of mind by saying that I wanted to be in at the death. It was nearly 11 when I started to return that night. The night was unexpectedly dark to me. Walking out of the lighted passage of my cousin's house, it seemed indeed black, and it was as hot and close as the day. Overhead, the clouds were driving fast, albeit not a breath stirred the shrubs. Not a breath stirred the shrubs about us. My cousin's man lit both lamps. Happily, I knew the road intimately. My wife stood in the light of the doorway and watched me until I jumped up into the dog cart. Then, abruptly, she turned and went in, leaving my cousins side by side, wishing me good luck. I was a little depressed at first with the contagion of my wife's fears, but very soon my thoughts reverted to the Martians. At that time, I was absolutely in the dark as to the course of the evening's fighting. I did not know even the circumstances that had precipitated the conflict. As I came through Occam, for that was the way I returned, and not through Send and Old Woking, I saw along the western horizon a blood-red glow, which, as I drew nearer, crept slowly up the sky. The driving clouds of the gathering thunderstorm mingled there with masses of black and red smoke. Ripley Street was deserted, and except for a lighted window or so, the village showed not a sign of life, but I narrowly escaped an accident at the corner of the road to Riford, where a knot of people stood with their backs to me. They said nothing to me as I passed. I do not know what they knew of things happening beyond the hill, nor do I know if the silent houses I passed on my way were sleeping securely, or deserted and empty, or harassed and watching against the terror of the night. From Ripley until I came through Riford, I was in the valley of the Way, and the red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill beyond the Riford church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered with the first intimation of the storm that was upon me. Then I heard midnight pealing out from Riford church behind me, and then came the silhouette of Mayberry Hill with its treetops and roofs black and sharp against the red. Even as I held this lurid green glare lit the road about me and showed the distant woods towards Addlestone. I felt a tug at the reins. I saw that the driving clouds had been pierced, as it were, by a thread of green fire, suddenly lighting their confusion and falling into the field to my left. It was the third falling star. Close on its apparition, and blindingly violent by contrast, danced out the first lightning of the gathering storm. And the thunder burst like a rocket overhead. The horse took the bit between his teeth and bolted. A moderate incline runs toward the foot of Mayberry Hill, and down this we clattered. Once the lightning had begun, it went on in as rapid a succession of flashes as I have ever seen. The thunderclaps, treading one on the heels of another, and with a strange crackling accompaniment, sounded more like the working of a gigantic electric machine than the usual detonating reverberations. The flickering light was blinding and confusing, and a thin hail of smoke gustily at my face as I drove down the slope. At first I regarded little but the road before me, and then abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Mayberry Hill. At first I took it for the wet roof of a house, but one flash following another showed it to be in swift rolling movement. It was an elusive vision, a moment of bewildering darkness, and then, in a flash like daylight, I saw the red masses of the orphanage near the crest of the hill, the green tops of the pine trees, and this problematic object that stood out clear and sharp and bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod, higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career. A walking engine of glittering metal, striding now across the heather, articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. Another flash, and the thing came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantly as it seemed with the next flash. 100 yards nearer. Can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowled violently along the ground? That was the impression those instant flashes gave. But instead of a milking stool, imagine it a great body of machinery on a tripod stand. Then suddenly the trees in the pine wood ahead of me were parted, as brittle reeds are parted by a man thrusting through them. They were snapped off and driven headlong, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing, as it seemed, headlong toward me. And I was galloping hard to meet it. At the sight of the second monster, my nerve went altogether. Not stopping to look again, I wrenched the horse's head hard around to the right, and in another moment the dog-cart had heeled over upon the horse, the shafts smashing noisily, and I was flung sideways and fell heavily into a shallow pool of water. I crawled out almost immediately and crouched, my feet still in the water under the clump of firs. The horse lay motionless. His neck was broken, poor brute, and by the lightning flashes I saw the black bulk of the overturned dog-cart and the silhouette of the wheels still spinning slowly. In another moment the colossal mechanism went striding by me and passed uphill toward Pierford. Seen nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere insensate machine driving on its way. Machine it was, with a ringing metallic pace and long, flexible, glittering tentacles, one of which gripped a young pine tree, swinging and rattling about its strange body. It picked its road as it went striding along, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved to and fro with the inevitable suggestion of a head looking about. Behind the main body was a huge mass of white metal, like a gigantic fisherman's basket, and puffs of green smoke squirted out from the joints of the limbs as the monster swept by me. And, in an instant, it was gone. I saw it all, vaguely in the shadow, in the, okay, let's try this again. I saw it all vaguely in the flickering lightning, in the blinding highlights and dense black shadows. As it passed, it set up an exultant, deafening howl that drowned the thunder. Alloo! Alloo! And in another minute, it was with its companion, half a mile away, stooping over something in the field. I had no doubt this thing in the field was the third of the 10 cylinders that they had fired at us from Mars. For some minutes I lay there in the rain and darkness, watching, by the intermittent light, these monstrous beings of metal moving about in the distance over the hedge-tops. A thin wail was now beginning, and as it came and went their figures grew misty, and then clear again. Now and then came a gap in the lightning, and night swallowed them up. I was soaked with hail above the puddle water below, and it was some time before my blank astonishment would let me struggle up the bank to a drier position, or think at all of my imminent peril. Not far from me was a little one-room squatter's hut of wood surrounded by a patch of potato garden. I struggled to my feet at last, and crouching and making use of every cover, I made a run for this. I hammered at the door, but I could not make the people hear, if there were any people inside. After a time I desisted, and availing myself of a ditch for the greater part of the way, succeeded in crawling unobserved by these monstrous machines into the pine wood toward Maybury. Under cover of this I pushed on, wet and shivering now, toward my own house. I walked among the trees, trying to find the footpath. It was very dark indeed in the wood, for the lightning was now becoming infrequent, and the hail, which was pouring down in a torrent, fell in columns through the gaps in the heavy foliage. If I had fully realized the meaning of all things I had seen, I should have immediately worked my way round through Byfleet to Street Cobham, and so gone back to rejoin my wife at Leatherhead. But that night the strangeness of things about me and my physical wretchedness prevented me, for I was bruised, weary, wet to the skin, and deafened and blinded by the storm. I had a vague idea of going on to my own house, and that was as much motive as I had. I staggered through the trees, fell into a ditch, and bruised my knees against a plank, and finally splashed out into the lane that ran down from the College Arms. I say splashed, for the storm water was sweeping the sand down the hill in a muddy torrent. There in the darkness a man blundered into me and sent me reeling back. He gave a cry of terror, sprang sideways, and rushed on before I could gather my wits sufficiently to speak to him. So heavy was the stress of the storm just as this place that I had the hardest task to win my way up the hill. I went close up to the fence on the left and worked my way along its palings. Near the top I stumbled upon something soft, and by the flash of lightning I saw between my feet a heap of black broadcloth and a pair of boots. Before I could distinguish how the man lay, the flicker of light had passed. I stood over him, waiting for the next flash. When it came, I saw that he was a sturdy man, cheaply but not shabbily dressed. His head was bent under his body, and he lay crumpled up close to the fence as though he had been flung violently against it. Overcoming the repugnance natural to one who had never before touched a dead body, I stooped and turned over him to feel for his heart. He was quite dead. Apparently his neck had been broken. The lightning flashed for a third time, and his face leaped upon me. I sprang to my feet. It was the landlord of the Spotted Dog, whose conveyance I had taken. I stepped over him gingerly and pushed up the hill. I made my way by the police station and the College Arms toward my own house. Nothing was burning on the hillside, though. From the common there still came a red glare and a rolling tumult of ruddy smoke beating up against the drenching hail. As far as I could see by the flashes, the houses about me were mostly uninjured. By the College Arms, a dark heap lay on the road. Down the road, toward Maybury Bridge, there were voices and the sound of feet, but I had not the courage to shout or to go to them. I let myself in with my latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door, staggered to the foot of the staircase, and sat down. My imagination was full of those striding metallic monsters and of the dead bodies smashed against the fence. I crouched at the foot of the staircase with my back to the wall, shivering violently. Chapter 11. At the Window. I have already said that my storms of emotion have a trick of exhausting themselves. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and there were little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room, and drank some whiskey, and then I was moved to change my clothes. After I had done that, I went upstairs to my study, but why I did so, I do not know. The window of my study looks over the trees and the railway toward Horsell Common. In the hurry of our departure, this window had been left open. The passage was dark, and by contrast with the picture of the window frame enclosed, the side of the room seemed impenetrably dark. I stopped short in the doorway. The thunderstorm had passed. The towers of the Oriental College and the pine trees about it had gone, and very far away, lit by a vivid red glare, the common about the sandpits was visible. Across the light, huge black shapes, grotesque and strange, moved busily to and fro. It seemed indeed as if the whole country in that direction were on fire, a broad hillside set with minute tongues of flame, swaying and writhing with the gusts of the dying storm, and throwing a red reflection upon the cloud scud above. Every now and then, a haze of smoke from some nearer conflagration drove across the window and hid the Martian shapes. I could not see what they were doing, nor the clear form of them, but recognized the black objects, nor recognized the black objects they were busied upon. Neither could I see the nearer fire, though the reflections of it danced on the wall and ceiling of the study. A sharp, resinous tang of burning was in the air. I closed the door noiselessly and crept toward the window. As I did so, the view opened out until, on the one hand, it reached to the houses about Woking Station, and on the other to the charred and blackened pines of Byfleet. There was a light down there was a light down below the hill on the railway near the arch, and several of the houses along Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light on the railway puzzled me at first. There was a black heap, a vivid glare, and to the right of that a row of yellow oblongs. And then I perceived this was a wrecked train. The foreparts smashed and on fire, the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these three main centers of light, the houses, the train, and the burning country toward Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. It was the strangest spectacle, that black expanse set with fire. It reminded me more than anything else of the potteries at night. At first I could distinguish no people at all, though I peered intently for them. Later I saw against the light of Woking Station a number of black figures hurrying one after the other across the line. And this was the little world in which I had been living securely for years. This fiery chaos. What had happened in the last 7 hours I still did not know, nor did I know how I was beginning, though I was beginning to guess, the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I had seen disgorged from the cylinder. With a queer feeling of impersonal interest, I turned my desk chair, to the window, sat down, and stared at the blackened country, and particularly at the three gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sand pits. They seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms? Such a thing I felt was impossible. Or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, and using much as a man's brain sits and rules in his body? I began to compare the things to human machines, to ask myself for the first time in my life how an ironclad or steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. The storm had left the sky clear, and over the smoke of the burning land, the little fading pinpoint of Mars was dropping into the west when a soldier came into my garden. I heard a slight scraping at the fence, and rousing myself from the lethargy that had fallen upon me, I looked down and saw him dimly, clambering over the palings. At the sight of another human being, my torpor passed, and I leaned out of the window eagerly. "Hist!" said I, in a whisper. He stopped astride the fence in doubt, and then he came over and across the lawn to the corner of the house. He bent down and stepped softly. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering, standing under the window and peering up. "Where are you going?" I asked. "God knows." "Are you trying to hide?" "That's it." "Come into the house," I said. I went down, unfastened the door, and let him in, and locked the door again. I could not see his face. He was hatless, and his coat was unbuttoned. "My God," he said as I drew him in. "What has happened?" I asked. "What hasn't?" In the obscurity I could see he made a gesture of despair. "They wiped us out. Simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. He followed me almost mechanically into the dining room. "Take some whiskey," I said, pouring out a stiff dose. He drank it, and then, abruptly, he sat down before the table, put his head on his arms, and began to sob and weep like a little boy. He was in a perfect passion of emotion, while I, with a curious forgetfulness of my own recent despair, stood beside him, wondering. It was a long time before he could steady his nerves to answer my questions, and then he answered perplexingly and brokenly. He was a driver in the artillery and had only come into action about 7. At that time, firing was going on across the common, and it was said the first party of Martians were traveling slowly toward their second cylinder under cover of the metal shield. Later, this shield staggered up on tripod legs and became the first of the fighting machines I had seen. The gun the soldiers drove had been unlimbered near Horsell in order to command the sand pits, and its arrival had precipitated the action. As the limber gunners went to the rear, his horse trod in a rabbit hole and came down, throwing him into a depression in the ground. At the same moment, the gun exploded behind him. The ammunition blew up. There was fire all about him, and he found himself lying under a heap of charred, dead men and dead horses. "I lay still," he said, "scared out of my wits, with the forequarter of a horse atop me. We'd been wiped out, and the smell, good God, like burnt meat. I was hurt across the back by the fall of the horse, and there I had to lie until I felt better, just like parade it had been a minute before, then stumble, bang, swish. Wiped out," he said. He had hid under the dead horse for a long time, peeping out furtively across the common. The Cardigan men had tried to rush in, skirmishing order at the pit, simply to be swept out of existence. Then the monster had risen to its feet and had begun to walk leisurely to and fro across the common among the few fugitives, with its head-like hood turning about exactly like the head of a cowled human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case, about which green flashes scintillated, and out of the funnel of this there smote the heat ray. In a few minutes there was, so far as the soldier could see, not a living thing left upon the common, and every bush and tree upon it that was not already a blackened skeleton was burning. The hussars had been on the road beyond the curvature of the ground, and he saw nothing of them. He heard the Maxims rattle for a time, and then become still. The giant saved Woking Station and its cluster of houses until the last. Then, in a moment, the heat ray was brought to bear, and the town became a heap of fiery ruins. Then the thing shut off the heat ray and turned its back upon the artillerymen, began to waddle away toward the smoldering pine woods that sheltered the second cylinder. As it did so, a second glittering titan built itself up out of the pit. The second monster followed the first, and at that the artillerymen began to crawl very cautiously across the hot heather ash toward Horsell. He managed to get alive into the ditch by the side of the road, and so escaped to Woking. There was his story, become ejaculatory. The place was impassable. It seems there were a few people alive there, frantic for the most part, and many burned and scalded. He was turned aside by the fire and hid among some almost scorching heaps of broken wall as one of the Martian giants returned. He saw this one pursue a man, catch him up in one of its steely tentacles, and knock his head against the trunk of a pine tree. At last, after nightfall, the artillerymen made a rush for it and got over the railway embankment. Since then, he had been skulking along toward Maybury in the hope of getting out of danger Londonward. People were hiding in trenches and cellars, and many of the survivors had made off toward Woking village and Send. He had been consumed with thirst until he found one of the water mains near the railway arch smashed and water bubbling out like a spring upon the road. That was the story I got from him, bit by bit. He drew calmer, telling me and trying to make me see the things he had seen. He had eaten no food since midday. He told me early in his narrative, and I found some mutton and bread in the pantry and brought it into the room. We lit no lamp for fear of attracting the Martians, and ever and again our hands would touch upon bread or meat. As he talked, things about us came darkly out of the darkness, and the trampled bushes and broken rose trees outside the window grew distinct. It would seem that a number of men or animals had rushed across the lawn. I began to see his face, blackened and haggard, as no doubt mine was also. When we had finished eating, we went softly upstairs to my study. I looked again out of the open window. In one night, the valley had become a valley of ashes. The fires had dwindled now. Where flames had been, were now streamers of smoke, but the countless ruins of shattered and gutted houses and blasted and blackened trees that the night had hidden stood out now gaunt and terrible in the pitiless light of dawn. Yet, here and there, some object had had the luck to escape. A white railway signal here, the end of a greenhouse there, white and fresh amid the wreckage. Never before in the history of warfare had destruction been so indiscriminate and so universal, and shining with its glowing light of the east, three of the metallic giants stood about the pit, their cowls rotating as though they were surveying the desolation they had made. It seemed to me that the pit had been enlarged, and ever and again puffs of vivid green vapor streamed up out of it toward the brightening dawn. Streamed up, whirled, broke, and vanished. Beyond were the pillars of fire about Chobham. They became pillars of bloodshot smoke, and at the first touch of dawn. And we'll end it there. That is the end of chapter 11. We've gone through 3 chapters today. The capability of the Martian invaders seems to be making itself even more evident, and our narrator is having to deal with a new kind of life in wartime, perhaps. So that's it for today. I hope you can join us again on a Wednesday at 4 p.m. for the next batch of chapters, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're reading along. And otherwise, have a great 2 days, and we will see you again hopefully on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.